the afternoon where a lot of you are. So my name is Mark Heslop. I'm the International Maths Subject Partner from Pearson. My background is in teaching. I spent 15 years in the classroom and joined Pearson about 3 years ago to support schools around the world. My role actually changed slightly in September, so now I'm dedicated to just supporting the international schools. So today we've got quite a packed agenda. This is more about kind of those finer points of the delivery of modular Maths International GCSE. Stephen says he does not have sound. Katrina, if you might want to send Stephen a message on that one, because it doesn't like.
Yeah, sure, no problem. If anyone else is having any difficulty.
So yeah, I'll fire up the agenda. We'll have a look. Okay, so we're going to be doing a quick overview of the assessment structure. We're going to be talking through that split of the content, that differences between modular and linear. And the good news for you is that this shouldn't make too much difference. Apart from arranging topics for Unit 1 and Unit 2, we've managed to arrange the topics in a sensible way so that it's the kind of questions and topics together that you're used to. So there's no big changes. There's going to be no, what I want to say is there's going to be no shocks in the assessment structure and the kind of questions that students are going to be sitting. Actually, if you were to look at a modular paper and a linear paper, without the covers, you wouldn't really be able to tell which one's which. If you looked at it carefully enough and, spotted Unit 1 topics and Unit 2 topics, you'd be able to tell. But there shouldn't be any surprises for students. We don't like students to have surprises. We like it all to feel familiar to them, because if it's familiar, they feel calm about it. We're going to be looking at how to prepare your students, those kind of finer points of things we might want to think about for year 10 entry, or if you're maybe in Egypt, that first year of the course entry, which for you is the equivalent to year 9 for a lot of people. Tiering decisions, some advice on how to use tiering and how to help this kind of thing with tiering decisions, because I'm fully aware from speaking to a lot of schools around the world that a lot of you are under a lot of pressure to enter students, under a lot of pressure from parents to enter their students for higher tier. And it's about having good information at your hand to have those rational conversations. So I can see the grading across the 2 tiers, and we actually have a percentage of students who are awarded that backstop grade of a grade 3 at the higher tier. And one argument would be if they're getting a 3 on the higher tier, then quite probably the foundation tier would have been a better experience for them. But I'll come to that shortly. And ways that you can use that variety of exam windows to help your students make progress. So let's go on to the assessment structure. So if you haven't seen it as yet, here's the main maths page. I should say, if you've got a question that you want everyone to see, do throw it into the meeting chat. But if you've just got a direct question for me or Katrina, do throw it into the Q&A section. That's something that only we'll be able to see. And I have built in time at the end for this, basically to answer your questions. So here's the main maths page. We've got specification and sample assessment materials. This is the page where we'll be uploading all the main materials for the course. There is the link to it. So in terms of that overall structure of modular and what is happening when. So first teaching from September 24, we launched the so I'm just going to mute Stephen for 1 second. We've got first teaching in September 24, specifications launched earlier in the year. First exams in May and June 2025, and I will say both the Unit 1s and the Unit 2s will be available next summer. I'll come to why that is slightly later. Exams will be in the same slot as the linear exams. So one thing that you can't do is enter students for effectively the modular exams and the linear exams in the same series. Define content per paper. So this is the principle that there is a list of content for paper 1, a list of content for paper 2, just like effectively in our International A level, which is a modular unitized structure. And a key thing here is that the papers are of equal difficulty. So that was a design requirement when we created the course, just like Pure 1 and Pure 2 are of the same difficulty in IAS level, and Pure 3 and Pure 4 are the same difficulty in targeted difficulty in International A level. Autumn and summer exam series, and I'll talk to you in a little bit about how you can use those, different ways that schools are planning to use those. It's been fascinating to talk to schools around the world to see how they plan and the kind of questions that they're asking about. Can I do it like this? And generally the answer is yes. And students cannot mix tiers in the same series. So if you think about Unit 1 Foundation and Unit 1 Higher Tier are in the same exam slot. Now, those of you who are used to our linear exams, you'll know that there's crossover questions. So the back 40% of the marks in the paper 1 linear is the same as the front 40% of the marks in the higher tier. So foundation and higher tier, we have crossover questions. So that means that a student cannot, in the same series, be entered for foundation and higher. And I'm going to stress in the same series, but I will come to how that helps us with tiering decisions later on. I'm just going to keep an eye out, see if there's anything relevant for me in the chat. Okay, good. And then first certification is in August 2025. So in terms of no surprises, linear, two times 2 hour papers, 100 marks, formula sheet included, calculator allowed, modular, exactly the same. The only difference being we've got defined content for Unit 1, defined content for Unit 2. And a lot of people have asked us, why are you doing modular specifications? Many reasons, including I think it eases their revision load, their revision stress. It allows you to take advantage of that idea of doing an early Unit 1 entry to spread their exam load across the 2 years. I think, and I firmly believe, because I came from the structure in the UK where we had modular exams for A levels, and we actually had a situation where we had a January entry, but about 2013, the government decided we shouldn't, they weren't going to allow the exam boards to do a January entry. And I thought, okay, well, maybe then they call it Pure 1 and Pure 2. We used to do Pure 1 in January. And I thought, okay, well, they've had 4 months further work on Pure 1, revision, consolidation. Hopefully that'll improve the Pure 1 results. And we'll see how we go. We put in a mock exam in January. It didn't make a blind bit of difference. The Pure 1 results were exactly the same when students sat them in the summer as when they sat them in January. That is to say, a lot of students actually needed to resit that from that first January entry. The Pure 2 results were half a grade down on average, and the Mechanics 1 results were 2/3 of the grade down on average. The impact of being effectively going from a modular AS level to a linear AS level. So I come at this from the point of, I think a modular system, it's not that students do better because it's easier. I think they do better because it produces students who are more willing to work. So that early entry of the first unit separated out students who could do the work but hadn't actually stepped up enough to the course and weren't doing enough effort, and after maybe not getting the result in the first exam they wanted, they then worked well and got the remaining exams right first time round. And that separated it out from students who actually really struggled with the maths, and it allowed us to target our intervention. So I think having the ability to split your units across a couple of exam series, that first live examination does something in a way that a mock examination does not do. I think it produces a lot of students who are much better able to learn, and also therefore allows you to target your intervention in a much better way for students who need it for their maths rather than who needed to up their study skill. So in terms of the assessment objectives, so these are the exact same assessment objectives in terms of the split of the content as the linear papers. So that's matched in the modular papers. I keep an eye on the time. So we've got 3 assessment objectives: number and algebra, shape, space and measure, and handling data. And these are exactly the same percentages that we have in the linear papers. And that's why I say, if you look at a linear paper and a modular paper without the cover, you actually won't be able to tell the difference unless you actually look at the content that's being assessed. Likewise, in terms of the skills that we're assessing, so we've got requirements for standard mathematical techniques, problem solving and mathematical reasoning. It's exactly the same as it is in the linear papers. So, and as you can see, a lot of people aren't aware of this. There's actually a slightly higher percentage of standard mathematical techniques in foundation tier. Katrina, can you just confirm that I'm still sharing my screen? I seem to have lost the ribbon at the moment.
Yeah, I can still see it. Thank you.
Got
If
words.
anyone wants to give a thumbs up or a little raised hand, just let us know that you can see the screen. Thank you. Yeah, cool.
And cool, thank you. And then slightly higher balance of problem solving and mathematical reasoning in the higher tier. So again, matching exactly what has happened in the linear papers. That works well. It produces the right spread of grade boundaries. We don't want grade boundaries to go too high at the top end because it becomes a test of speed and accuracy. And we want there to be some headroom at the top of our paper so that students can make a mistake, or maybe there's a topic they just can't do, but they've shown us enough evidence elsewhere of the grade they're working at. Equally, we don't want the grade boundaries at the bottom end to go too low, because that reflects kind of a poor student experience. We want all students to be able to feel that they've done themselves justice. And I think our linear papers actually do that. We've got we actually ran a study on one of our trials on modular, students answering questions in a modular and linear way. And it was kind of a long-held belief that a question performs in the way that it does because of the nature of the paper it's taken in, where it is in the paper, and the questions that were also in that paper. And when we actually rearranged questions into a modular fashion and had two parallel groups of taken themselves, linear papers all mixed up, modular papers with defined content per paper, we actually found evidence that by and large, in terms of the relative difficulty of the question, it's independent of whether a question is being taken in a modular format or a linear format. Okay, so that gives us confidence that you can actually move questions around between modular and linear, or you can use grade statistics that we publish to look at how students do, because they tend to perform the same relative to the other questions in SAF test as they would do when that data came from the original examination. That gives us a lot of confidence to match questions between modular and linear papers and have an idea of the question performance. My only caveat on that, my only thought is that questions at the very last question on a paper can sometimes underperform, because you sometimes get students who are then running out of time. So the last question on a paper may not perform, may perform actually slightly better if it was taken slightly earlier in a paper. Okay, as per our international A level, and if you don't teach international A level, effectively students are awarded a uniform marks scale. So, and it's the UMS that gets combined together from their paper 1 and their paper 2 to go to create effectively their overall grade. So if a student gains a grade 9 on the grade boundaries from the marks on the paper, they're awarded 108 UMS on each paper. And if they get 216 out of their overall 2 papers, they're effectively awarded a grade 9. Why don't we just add up the marks? Well, students can be taking these papers in different series. So a student could be taking both paper 1 and paper 2 in the same series, unit 1, unit 2 in the same series. They could be taking it across an October series and a June series. And the examiners do pride themselves on being able to set very similar difficulty papers from one year to the next. But we actually need to just make sure that it's absolutely fair for students taking it in different ways, that they're being awarded the grade in the same way. So this is the uniform mark scale. It's in the specification. Okay. Modular papers, the only thing you'll see different, and this is a link to the actual sample assessment materials, is the actual codes on the front of the paper. Everything else will look absolutely the same. We don't want there to be any surprises for students and teachers. Same formula sheet. I'm going to say, if you're coming to us from another board, we have absolutely no plans to introduce a non-calculator paper. I don't think it'll make a difference for your grade 9 students whether they do a non-calculator paper or a calculator paper. But for your grades 6, maybe some of your grade 7 students and below, we know it's all about motivation to revise. So we actually think a calculator model for 2 papers is the best way forward. You know, if you're new to us, we do assess non-calculator skills within the papers. For instance, we might ask students to rationalize a surd, or at foundation level, show all the stages to manipulating fractions. So I think non-calculator skills are absolutely vital. I don't think they should form 50% of the assessment. We would prefer students to be focusing on their problem-solving skills, which is what our assessments are more geared towards. Next coming up, we've actually got the link to the scheme of work, which many of you hopefully have seen by now. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. I want to talk about that content split shortly. So we've got effectively the specification references, opportunities for problem solving, and common misconceptions in any notes. So it's good if you've got non-specialist teachers in your departments, which I know can be an issue for some schools where they're having to have teachers from another department teaching their maths. It's very good for those purposes. Now then, in terms of the guided learning hours, I'm going to fire both of these up at all. So overall, so this is the higher tier, and I wanted to just talk to you a second about how we created the content split. So what you'll see across both units of the course is all three assessment objectives. So number and algebra, shape and space, and handling data. One of our original starting points was a model where it was felt one option was to give the students all the number and algebra in year one and just a tiny bit of shape and space and the handling data in year two. We tested that, we had a look at it, we interviewed teachers and they didn't like it. So we actually went with the preferred model of more of a spiral approach of keeping all three assessment objectives in year one and all three assessment objectives in year two. A lot of teachers felt they didn't want their students to leave things like all shape and space and handling data for a year before coming back to it. And they actually felt it would make the year one very dry. Basically, we were just teaching number and algebra for the overall majority of the year. But what we've built is a system where we have number and algebra in year one, where we can actually test it and build it into, say, shape and space problems and handling data problems, and then the same in year two. Now, the eagle-eyed of you will have actually spotted this. So we've actually chosen 70 hours of teaching time in year one with 10 hours of revision, and then 90 hours of teaching time in year two, and then 10 hours of revision before the exams. Why? We did that very carefully. We spent a lot of time thinking about the topics in year one and year two. The papers are equally weighted. They have the same amount of effectively topics in it. Now, we're aware that, and if you think about when I used to teach a modular maths course in the UK, effectively we start in September of year 10. We have the autumn term, we have the spring term, and then effectively we're into revision before an exam in May and the start of June. And then we started immediately on year two. Much as those of you that are teaching the International A level, effectively the International AS level is autumn term and spring term, International AS level exams, and then you've got nearly a full year before the students do the final International A level exams. So we very carefully chose topics for the year one that, although they generate the right spread of marks and the right spread of questions, are more efficient to teach. So some of the topics that we've chosen for year two take longer to teach, so it made more sense to put those in the year two than the year one. So what we haven't got is a split of 50-50 on the teaching hours. We've actually got about a 40-60%, 70, so I should say, is there? It's a ratio of 7 to 9 between the two halves of the course. But we've, as I say, we've carefully chosen those topics that are efficient to teach in year one. And a lot of things that are at the start of the course, we can't assume that students have studied our international lower secondary curriculum. So they're built into it as teaching time in case they have studied that. You might find that actually you whiz through a lot of that earlier stuff at the start of year one, especially for your higher tier students. There is absolutely nothing wrong with, before the end of, effectively before their exam, unit one exams, moving some of the unit two content forward into your year one. So these are kind of the considerations you may want to make. Okay, so mapping documents. I do hope that makes sense. We'll try to be as sensible about this as we can. And there were an awful lot of teachers involved in these decisions, and we've really come across this from kind of a teaching perspective. What makes a logical progression of topics through the 2 years that is then teachable by you and accessible by your students in the classroom. Okay, so If you are interested at all in the mapping between the linear and the modular specifications, we have got a mapping document on our website. It goes in both directions. So this is effectively the linear specification. You can see there's a couple of topics here that have been moved into Unit 2. And then this is effectively the second sheet, which is the modular version of all the Unit 1s gathered together and the Unit 2s gathered together. And we've highlighted in here, just to make it a little bit easier for people, exactly where the higher tier and foundation tier content is. One of the things that I get a question about is that the references for the specification of modular may look a little bit odd. So we've got in here, this is specification point 1.1 A foundation, 1.1 B foundation. We've rearranged the content between two units. We've kept the specification references the same as in linear. So it might be when you're looking at the modular Unit 1, you sometimes see a gap in the specification references. That's because though that content is now in Unit 2, but we've kept the specification references the same. That felt important because I know a lot of your schemes of work include specification references. And what we didn't want you to have to do was, if you're adjusting a current scheme of work, we didn't want you to have to try and map out what is the linear specification reference and what is the modular specification reference. We kept them the same, so you can go, okay, that's Unit 1, that's Unit 2. I've seen where those are using this mapping spreadsheet, just to make it as easy as possible for you to transfer your schemes of work between a modular and a linear format. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, that might explain why you sometimes see gaps in that Unit 1 specification references. Like I say, we've tried to be as sensible about this as we possibly can, but some of it takes a little bit of explanation. So, entry window options. Okay. There is absolutely nothing wrong if you are a school that are toying with the idea of modular, but maybe your principal is against that disruption of or that thinking that there might be a disruption of entering students in year 10 for their first unit. And all I would say is that the absolute majority of schools have a mock at the end of year 10. So why not just enter them for the live examination? It's marked by the examiners. We know students work harder towards a live examination than they do an internal mock. All the data is uploaded into Results Plus. Having said that, if you wish to continue with a linear course with exams at the end, there is absolutely nothing against using the modular examinations at the end of the 2 years. I've just seen, Mariam, I've just seen your comment in the chat. Will the assessment objectives have the same weighting in the 2 units? Absolutely. So it's exactly the same spread of AO 1, 2, and 3 between the 2 units, Unit 1 and Unit 2, as it is in the linear paper. The only difference is defined content for paper 1 and defined content for paper 2. Brings me back to this point. So you can use the modular papers in a linear way at the end of the 2 years. That brings certain advantages in terms of efficiency of revision. You know, I spent 15 years in education. I've been ahead of maths. I know revising for exams is stressful for students. So there's nothing wrong with using the modular exam. So they've got defined content for paper 1 and defined content for paper 2 to just help them focus their revision, make their revision more efficient and reduce their stress, because we know if we can get their stress level down, they will do better. And I also think there's advantages, you know, I know we're here to talk about maths, but if we can help them be less stressed on their maths and more efficient on their maths, that means that they're probably more likely to be less stressed about their other subjects and be more efficient about their revision across the board and do better in their other examinations. So I think there are definite advantages in terms of helping students manage their stress levels as they're coming up to exams if you're using the modular papers at the end of a linear course. Okay. Alternative options. So this is was the main planned option that we worked around. So Unit 1 in summer of year 10, or if you're in Egypt, a year earlier, because we know you like to finish your course by the end of year 10. So Unit 1, summer of year 10, Unit 2, at the end of year 11. So that's kind of the main option that it's planned around. There is nothing wrong with then in the autumn series doing a resit of unit 1 if the students want to improve their grade, or even they could actually resit unit 1 in the summer of year 11. So they could do it in the autumn term. Some schools might not like a little bit of disruption. There's too many students, but at least they get effectively another crack at it, like they do with international A levels. And then the final one here is an interesting one. So I've spoken to schools that say, well, we're actually planning to use the unit 1 in the autumn of year 11. So we're not going to do an entry in year 10. We're going to leave it until the autumn of year 11 when they've got a bit more experience under their belt. They're working through some of the unit 2 content, and they might just be a little bit more mature. So these are the options you've got, and it really does depend on your students. But then, of course, they've got that option then to resit unit 1 in the summer of year 11. There's one final point in here, and it was actually raised by some schools in Switzerland. Even if you're planning to, if you don't like a modular course, you want to do the exams at the end of the 2 years, there are advantages to entering for the modular examinations. So for instance, in Switzerland, I have schools saying to me that regardless of what university course they want to go and do, they need at least a grade 5 in their International GCSE. So if your students have taken the linear course and they haven't achieved a grade 5 and they need to resit in the 6th form, they're going to need to resit both the linear papers. If your students, even taking them in a linear way with both exams at the end of year 11 and they've taken the modular papers, maybe there's one paper they didn't do as well on, and to improve their grade, they could do one paper at a time in the 6th form, which has less of an impact on their 6th form studies. Equally, you might have a student that's aiming for a top university, and maybe they've got a grade 8 in International GCSE in year 11, really good grade, but they think it would look better for them to have a grade 9 on their university application. Again, modular papers allows them to take one paper at a time to try and improve their grade with less of an impact on their studies. I hope that makes sense. It's something that actually hadn't occurred to a lot of people, and it hadn't occurred to us when we were actually setting up the course. This is coming from talking to teachers, which is I always enjoy doing. Okay, content split. So I'm going to have a look at the assessment objectives in turn so you can see the progression between the two areas of the content. Okay, so in terms of AO1, we have basic number skills, limits of accuracy, surds and indices. Now remember, the papers are of equal difficulty, so we actually have to have a high spread of high grade information content and low grade content in both halves of the course. Unit 2 is where we bring in ratio and proportion, percentage skills, standard form, and repeated percentage change. So the main percentage skills are in Unit 2. However, I should say, basic number skills does include, when you look at the specification points, converting between fractions, decimals, and percentages, which is useful for students because we actually have the probability work in year 1. And that's why we ensured those specification points were in the year 1 of the course. When it comes to the progression, it's probably more interesting to look at the algebra. So in Unit 1, we have basic algebra skills, we have the set notation, we have plotting graphs, solving quadratics. So this is where your foundation tier content stops. Solving quadratics effectively by factorization for monic equations, so unitary x squared. And then your higher tier students go on to do solving quadratics in terms of multiples of x squared. They also do completing the square and the quadratic formula. Now that felt important to include in the Unit 1 content because it goes nicely with the other content that we've got in year 1 for your higher tier students. So conditional probability, especially when there are an unknown number, say, we pick a bead out of the bag and it's red, and the probability is something. The second bead, the probability is something else. We don't give them the number of beads in the bag. Those kind of questions often result in a quadratic. So it felt important that quadratic was one of the absolutely key skills to include in the year 1 of the course, because it feeds into so many other topics and questions, problem solving questions in both year 1 and year 2. When we look at the year 2 content, this is where we bring in inequalities, simultaneous equations, so simultaneous equations linking in with effectively plotting graphs. So just a reminder that in year 1, we're plotting graphs up to including cubic on there by substitution. This is where we bring in the sequences. I'm going to talk about change of subject in a second. So that's for your foundation tier students. Algebraic proof comes in at year 2. Direct inverse and inverse proportion comes in. Summation of arithmetic series, function notation and transformation. So again, linking back to those year 1 graphs topics, nicely extending it in year 2 as a progression of graphs, and differentiation. Now, although we have change of subject in year 2, I'm going to specify that those are the questions where we say make the subject of a formula. Difference between foundation and higher tier, just to remind you, foundation tier, the subject will only appear once. Higher tier, we could have the subject appearing twice in the actual formula itself, and the students need to factorize to rearrange that. Students do need the skills of algebraic manipulation of expressions and formulae within year 1. So when we're rearranging equations, forming an equation and rearranging it, so those skills are taught in year 1, but we only formally test where we ask students to make a certain variable the subject of an equation in year 2. So what I don't want people to think is that we've got a strange disconnect, that we're asking students to solve an equation only in year 2. We're not. We're asking students to apply algebraic manipulation in years 1 and year 2. Excuse me. And formally rearranging for a subject is only going to be tested within year 2. Hope that makes sense. If you've got any queries on that one, do drop me something in the chat. Again, this is where we've got those solving basic quadratics feeding into a lot of other topics. So for instance, inequalities, quadratic inequalities, linear and non-linear simultaneous equations for your higher tier students in year 2. Solving problems involving differentiation can sometimes involve quadratics. Now, that leads to a question I regularly get asked. Does a student need to learn all the year 1 content when they're revising for year 2? And the answer is no, not really. So we've taken the same approach that we have with our International A level. So in theory, everything from Pure 1 is a prerequisite for Pure 2. What students don't have to do when they're taking their Pure 2 exam is go back and revise all the Pure 1 content. Why not? But what students are doing when they're revising for Pure 2 is those skills are built into Pure 2 questions, and they're effectively revising their Pure 1 content as they're working towards their Pure 2. So to give you an example on this one, when students are solving simultaneous equations, especially nonlinear, and learning it in class, they're automatically using and revising their quadratic skills. We would only assess year 1 content or unit 1 content in year 2 where it's built into a skill in another question. Just like Pure 1 and Pure 2 in International A level, where you've got indefinite integrals in year 1, and then you're in Pure 1, and then definite integrals in year 2. It's the same skills, but extended. That's the approach. It felt important to go with that approach. So you're going to be reworking or extending this Pure 1 unit 1 content as you're teaching unit 2. What you won't see is effectively just a pure unit 1 standalone question within unit 2. That wouldn't make sense to do. We've got other things we want to assess. They would be built in as skills within new content in your unit 2 work. And I do have a list of topics that we won't assess in year 2 because they weren't topics that could be extended. It didn't make sense to try and bring them together with unit 2 content. They didn't lend themselves to that. So we've got a defined list of actual content that students don't need for unit 2. And I'll show you that slide in a little while. So going on to the shape and space. So this is where we've got those basic properties of areas of shape. So these are the kind of questions that we sometimes for higher tier students build in with algebra. So maybe there's a trapezium, we've got x plus 3 and x plus 5 on one of the sides, and maybe the height is x. Those are the kind of things that actually, and we give them the area, and we ask them to work out, say, the length of the smallest side. Those are the kind of questions that result in a quadratic. So again, it makes sense to have quadratics in that year 1 content. Trigonometry is in year 1. A lot of students will have covered that lower down in the school, and in the case of them finishing it off and reconsolidating that knowledge for your foundation to students. Compound measures, so speed, density, and pressure is in here. Sine and cosine rule. So remember, we've got to have that spread of higher ability topics within the Unit 1 content. Sine area of a triangle and 3D Pythagoras theorem in the year 1. And then in the year 2 content, this is where we start to bring in those kind of angles and polygons problems. So we've got angles, polygons, circles. This is where your circle theorems are. Symmetry, because we've actually got to have some nice, easy questions in the year 2 content to give a nice balance and feel to the students when they take the papers. Constructions, volume calculations, similarity, transformations. So that's effectively your reflection, rotation, etc. Not necessarily the algebraic transformations, but if you look, and I'm going to go back one, this is where we do function notation transformations for your higher tier students in Unit 2. So you can build those together if you feel that it suits your student. Circle theorems for your higher tier students, similar area and volume, and then vector problems just for your higher tier students. So I think we've got kind of a nice balance. Yes, I'm aware that there are some harder topics in year 1 for the students, but actually we felt that although students find those questions difficult, it is accessible for them to be taught it within Unit 1 content. I wouldn't have necessarily suggested a topic like vectors or transformation of graphs would be suitable for a year content. So we've tried to think about the maturity of the students as they progress across the 2 years of the course. Okay. Handling data. So what you will actually see is a slightly higher emphasis on handling data within effectively the Unit 1 than the Unit 2. And if you actually look back slightly in terms of the volume, you'll actually see a slightly higher volume of teaching time of shape, space, and measure in year 2 than year 1. We didn't want to split topics up unnecessarily. So although we've got all the AO 1 to 3 in both halves of the course, we've probably got slightly higher emphasis on probability, because it's very accessible to what if you've got slightly more algebraically immature students in year 1 than in year 2, and it gives that nice balance to the course. So effectively, we have all the probability in year 1. So basic probability, tree diagrams, conditional probability, and then histograms in year 1, and then statistical measures and cumulative frequency diagrams within year 2. So they're the big headline measures. What we won't be doing is assessing probability within year 2. We're not going to do that. I'll show you that list in a short time when we look at that topic that's only in year 1. But it felt like an emphasis on probability in year 1 with some effectively raw statistics on handling data in terms of histograms. We've actually got two-way tables in there for your foundation tier students, and then the statistical measures, so mean, median, mode, and range in the Unit 2. Yes, that could easily have gone into the year 1 content, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with you moving year 2 content into year 1 as long as you're aware of what's being assessed. And then cumulative frequency diagrams in on the year 2 content, because that lends itself to those calculations on effectively mode and range, etc. Okay, so revision considerations. I think we've got to be aware of the maturity of students. And so what I spent time doing is looking at, if we're preparing students for year 1, if a student was slightly less algebraically mature, what topics would I, as a teacher, want to maybe increase the emphasis on during revision time with students compared to if they were doing it at the end of the 2 years? So I've kind of put together a list, had a look at some of the statistics of where I would recommend to you that we maybe shouldn't just assume that the students can do it in a way that we might do in year 2. I haven't necessarily picked out these are the hardest topics from year 1, because those are the obvious ones, things like sine and cosine rules for your higher tier students. I picked out ones where I think students might need a bit more support. We might need to do things slightly differently from a linear course, just to take into account they're taking these qualifications a year early. So in terms of the AO1 number, I think for your foundation tier students, I see, certainly when we get slightly early entry from students, index notation and index law for multiplication and division of positive and negative integer powers, including 0. I think that's one that's worthwhile just spending a bit more time in our revision, or just putting it into our revision in a way that we may not do in a linear course. Certainly, I see solving quadratics by factorization being an issue for some foundation tier students, and I'm going to elaborate on that. Not necessarily, I think students lose the link. We see in examination scripts, if we ask students to factorize a quadratic at foundation tier, often they will go on and waste time and solve it. It's not an equation set equal to 0, but they will attempt to solve it. They don't get penalized for that, by the way. It's, ignore subsequent working in the mark schemes. But I think if it's a topic to just raise as a bit of a priority, that making sure that foundation tier students are aware of that difference between factorizing and when we can solve, when it's effectively an equation, and just maybe spending a little bit more time on that point, perhaps in our teaching, certainly during revision. In terms of shape, space, and measure, Pythagoras' theorem, and I'm going to be a bit more precise about this. Foundation tier students are absolutely fine in examinations on finding the hypotenuse. In fact, I've seen a foundation tier question where there was one triangle on top of another, and then you need to use the first two sides to work out the hypotenuse, and then apply that with an x side to work out a second hypotenuse. I've seen foundation tier students do that more reliably than when they're working at two Pythagoras's together, than when they're actually trying to find a sign that is not the hypotenuse. And that's worthwhile maybe taking forward as a teaching point for your students in the next year or so. So it's that's where that mental level of that step up in difficulty occurs for your foundation tier students. Handling data. So using different methods of presenting tables. It's not necessarily the two-way tables that's the problem for your foundation tier students. If you look in examinations, this is where we build it into effectively basic probability calculations. And students tend to underperform on that kind of question. And finally, finding probabilities from a Venn diagram is often a tricky one for your foundation tier students. In terms of higher tier revision, okay, manipulating surds, there's a real balance of maturity for your higher tier students. Some actually get it quite late in the course in terms of being able to rationalize, I've got confidence to have a go at these questions. So just want to be aware of, and feeding into that or leading into that is using index law to simplify. Now I come at that because that's then progressed as to standard form in unit 2. So please do just a little bit, bit more emphasis in our revision. Students do struggle with upper and lower bounds, and what we tend to see is them just effectively. So there was a question last year, I think it was on the volume of the sphere, and they had to work out the upper and lower bounds of the mass. They just answered the question as if there was no bounds involved, and I would read that to mean I don't think it's that's what they thought they should be doing. They were just trying anything because they didn't know what they should be doing. They didn't know how to work with bounds. So just a bit more emphasis potentially on bounds in year 10. And then the final one on the number, effectively the number in algebra, is solving quadratics, but I've underlined here by completing the square is the issue for those students. Shape, space, and measure. Provide reasons using standard geometrical statements. I've not put the rest of the detail in, but students tend to lose easy marks when they're doing the written justification of, say, a circle theorem. They tend to write angles in a triangle equals 180. That doesn't get the mark compared to angles in a triangle sum to 180. That's what gets them off. So again, a bit more revision of that. Pythagoras in 3 dimensions, I guess we could probably say that new students would struggle with that one. And then in terms of handling data, it's the constructing and interpreting histograms that they tend to struggle on. We tend to know that they're going to struggle with the probability. They're hard questions, that's okay. In my opinion, they slightly underperform on the histograms questions. And then again, highlighting one that kind of know is difficult and maybe even more difficult for some of the year 10 students, conditional probability. So unit 1 only content. So this is the content that does not make sense to combine with the unit 2 content. It doesn't naturally lend itself to being built on by the unit 2 assessment objectives or brought together with questions. So if you think about going back to those two-way tables, there's a reason why two-way tables is actually in unit 1. And we've actually split a specification point there to include two-way tables in unit 1, because often it's really good to set a basic probability question for your foundation tier students based on a two-way table. So it makes sense for those two to be in the same unit or sequentially. As the probability was in unit 1, it made sense to put the two-way tables in unit 1. Well, these are the topics that doesn't make sense to actually extend. So converting recurring decimals into fractions, and I've underlined this one because it's a higher tier content only. So that will only be assessed in unit 1. Upper and lower bounds will only be assessed in unit 1. Set language and Venn diagrams, there's nothing that we can actually build that into in unit 2. So again, that will all be in unit 1. Shape, space, and measure. Effectively, we've got understand and use the relationship to average speed, distance, and time is a unit 1 only content. And then AO3, construct and interpret histograms and probability. So you can see in here that Venn diagrams and the probability often go together, so they will both only will be in unit 1. Okay. Tiering and resets. So I know that a lot of students are under a lot of pressure in terms of tiering, and I'll just come at the reset rules for a second. So the reset rules from the specification, learners can reset any unit irrespective of whether qualification is to be cashed in, so that you don't have to cash in. And even if it's not cashed in, they can still reset a unit, or if it has been cashed in, you can reset a unit and recash it in. If a learner resets a unit more than once, only the better of the 2 more recent attempts of that unit will be available for aggregation to a qualification grade. Okay, we don't want students to be put unit 1 in the autumn, in the summer of year 10, the autumn of year 10, the summer of year 11, just to try and hedge your bets on putting through as many exams as possible. That's not really in the interest of students. So this rule is trying to encourage people to put students in at the best time for them. And in terms of tiering options, so one option would be for your students to do unit 1 in the summer of year 10. I'm just going to move my windows around, just check if there's anything else in the chat. Okay, so unit 1 in the summer of year 10. Now, I know you've got a lot of pressure from parents to enter students for the higher tier. And like I say, we actually get probably a higher proportion of the grade 3s awarded at higher tier than is healthy for the students. And I think that comes from parental pressure. Okay. So, year 11, if a student does badly in the summer of year 10, you actually have some evidence to talk to parents, go, look, we're actually going to try them in foundation unit 1 in the summer and the autumn of year 11, so that next series, and then use that to make the decision on, for the summer of year 11, whether to finish foundation unit 2 or higher unit 2. You cannot do foundation 1 and higher 1 in the same series, nor can you do foundation 2 and higher 2 in the same series. But you can do them across subsequent series. So you could then go, okay, we'll use this foundation 1 in year 11 to make and have some, a rational conversation with parents about what is the best for their student, because it might be that they actually stand a better chance of getting, say, a grade 5 on the foundation tier, whereas they might get a grade 3 on the higher tier. Cutting down that higher tier content to foundation can have a positive impact on the students. And it's also more efficient for them to be able to revise for their other subjects if they're taking the slightly smaller content of the foundation tier. Equally, you can go the other way. So if you've got a foundation tier class, and I know some schools do, you could do foundation unit 1 in the summer of year 10. And if you've got some students that are really knocking on the top end of that, those good grade 5s in year 10, you could consider that, seeing how they do and teaching them the remaining content for the higher tier unit 1 in the autumn term, and then using that as a judgment call for whether you want to finish off the foundation tier unit 2 or the higher tier unit 2 within the summer. I hope that makes sense. I think that's going to make outcome. I think we're going to get more students entered for the right tier ultimately, the tier that's better for their ability. And I hope that makes it, like some of those tricky conversations with parents, easier for you. Okay, I'm just going to rearrange my screen a second. Okay, so in terms of support, you have on our website a guide to all our maths qualifications. So the specification A and the modular version of it, specification B, which is often taken in India and Bangladesh as a kind of something more similar to their local qualifications, and the extension, the further pure maths 1 qualification. If you are coming to us from Cambridge International and you haven't seen it yet, so if maybe this is your first time teaching the Pearson course, we actually have a mapping document on our website which goes absolutely line by line the differences between 95–98% the same, but it gives you that confidence of exactly where those minor differences are if you're coming over to us from Cambridge. It also gives you guidance of, for instance, what's in the core tier of Cambridge and what's in effectively our higher tier, and the other way around. In terms of textbook mappings, within the next week or so, we'll be publishing a mapping guide and between how to use the linear textbooks for a modular course, and ultimately, and I can't confirm a date, we'll be producing fully modular textbooks to support the course. The good news for that one is, broadly speaking, from the textbooks, it's entire chapter chunks rather than splitting chapters between the two halves of the course. So we'll be doing Unit 1 and Unit 2 mapping guidance within the textbooks, and I get feedback for those of you that have foundation tier students. Can we have more information on what is foundation tier only content in the textbook? And the answer is yes. So we've asked for that. We're building that in, so you'll be able to see exactly which questions your foundation tier students only need to do, and that you're on, and then the remaining questions that your higher tier students, just to make that teaching of foundation tier students a little bit easier for you. And that information, when we do the next version of the textbook, will be built in for you. How are we doing for time? Got 5 minutes to go. Hopefully that has been useful to you. The main message really from me is that the questions will be the same as in the linear. You won't see questions built in different ways to what you're used to, which means the bank of exam questions on Exam Wizard will still be perfectly accessible for you. Lots of advantages to the modular course. For instance, that Unit 1 entry in Year 10, those results are being uploaded to Results Plus for your analysis. Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to this one. It's been a good 12 months. I hope that's been useful. If you think there's anything that I've missed in here that you would like to see more of, do please drop it into the feedback form. If you want me to reach out to you, if you've got specific questions about something else, or this is maybe your first time teaching the course, do reach out. I put my profile link to LinkedIn right at the start of the chat. Do follow me on LinkedIn. I'm going to recopy that down now. Hopefully the link will copy with it. Yeah, there we go. It's worked through. Do follow me on LinkedIn. That's where we put latest documentation and updates and notification of courses. But I hope that's been useful. We've tried to be as sensible about this as possible from two aspects. One, what's going to make a coherent course for students to learn in terms of their math progression, but it also be a coherent course in terms of that split of the teaching time between Units 1 and Unit 2 to make it actually quite enjoyable for you to teach. We didn't want it to be a stressful experience. We wanted it to be an entirely logical experience. Yep, do reach out to you if you need anything more. And I'm going to hang around for a couple of minutes now if any of you've got any very specific questions, you can throw it into the chat. Okay, so I've just seen a comment on, is there a question bank on Unit 1 and Unit 2? You can see those topics on Exam Wizard, but that's a very good point. I'll raise that with the Exam Wizard team as to whether we can realign those. I'm just going to make a note. That's a very good point. Whether we can realign the existing questions into effectively Unit 1 and Unit 2 on the modular version for Exam Wizard. I will ask that question. We did do it previously for when we've transitioned between sort of legacy international A levels to new international A levels. We've realigned the questions, so I'll ask if that's planned. That's a very good question. So thanks, Satya. It's a good question. I love this session. They're great. My main message from all of this, is the final thing I'll say, is I think it's going to be a very easy transition for you from that linear over to the modular. It felt really important to keep this kind of the specification point references the same between linear and modular to make life as easy as possible. Well, thank you very much for joining. Have a good day. I'll hang around.